Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time, Sherman attempted to avoid the politics of Reconstruction. This week, Sherman dives into military operations against Native American tribes. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Thank you. Sherman believed that the American West represented the last location where a soldier could be a soldier. Fight Native Americans as white encroachment continued to shrink the world of the various tribes, those that had been relocated, and those who had called the West their home for generations. In the post-Civil War era, the United States Army would shrink from 54,000 in 1866 to around 35,000 in 1869. The number would eventually drop to 25,000, where it would remain for most of Sherman's time in the post-war Army. One of Sherman's biographers described Sherman's feelings towards Native Americans. On the one hand, he felt sorry for them as individuals and insisted that whites should be fair to them, but they exasperated him because of their stubborn opposition to the movement of white society, and because of the pathos their condition often engendered. Their very way of life represented the kind of anarchy he had feared all of his life. Their mobility and closeness to nature appeared at odds with stability and order. He did not want to exterminate them, but he hoped that they would become what he viewed as productive members of society. However, if they didn't act in the way Sherman believed they should act, he would stomp out the resistance. He wrote, "During an assault, the soldiers cannot pause to distinguish between male and female, or even discriminate as to age. As long as resistance is made, death must be meted out. But the moment all resistance ceases, the firing will stop, and all survivors turned over to the proper Indian agent." Especially referring to Plains tribes, Sherman criticized them for their nomadic lifestyle and reliance on the American bison and other game. His beliefs were shared by many Americans in that era, believing Native Americans to be lazy and wasted land. He claimed that 20,000 Native Americans would need the entire state of Nebraska to sustain their people, when Euro-Americans could feed 2 million on the same patch of ground. Sherman wanted them to adopt the Euro-American way of living. Only then would Sherman acquiesce to their rights to the land. He would claim the struggle between the United States and the various tribes in the West was a test of the survival of the fittest. He would commonly say and wholeheartedly believe the only good Indian is a dead Indian. The Army's enlisted men in the West were mostly urban workers and immigrants, a mixed bag of good and bad, skilled and unskilled, black and white. They earned low pay, a private receiving only $13 a month. Their training was sparse when it occurred at all, and their units were always under strength. Promotion was slow, discipline was harsh, food was often barely edible, and living conditions were spare. In the average frontier fort, the barracks, which housed a company or two, were made of logs, rough lumber, or adobe. They were dusty and dirty, and provided little protection against the wind or the sun. Save for the periodic campaign, days were filled with choking dust, extremes of heat and cold, tedium, and the search for an elusive enemy. The Army would fight Native Americans differently than they fought Confederates. Because the Native American warriors would use hit-and-run tactics, the U.S. soldiers would hit groups from multiple sides, keeping the bands constantly moving, wearing them out, then striking when the tribe was nearly surrounded. Sherman launched campaigns in the wintertime when families were together, most attempting to survive the winter. What resulted was the death of women and children in these campaigns. The United States was split on how to deal with Native Americans. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was in the Interior Department, but Sherman wanted it in the War Department, so they would be able to work in coordination with one another and so the Bureau would be subordinate to the Army. Ulysses S. Grant liked the idea before he became president, but when he took the role as Commander-in-Chief, he decided to keep the Bureau out of the War Department, naming his friend and military secretary Ely Parker as Indian Commissioner. With Grant as president, he promoted Sherman to General-in-Chief to take his old role. However, some politics began to creep into Sherman's life. When Grant became president, he signed General Orders No. 11, which made the Secretary of War and President communicate through the General of the Army, instead of being able to dictate their orders to individual commanders within the Army. Sherman liked this situation, but the Secretary of War, John M. Schofield, would be replaced soon with Grant's wartime Chief of Staff, John A. Rawlins. Rawlins convinced Grant to rescind the order. Sherman met with Grant at the White House to try to talk sense into the president, but Grant wouldn't budge. which began to strain the two men's friendship. When Rawlins died in September 1869, Sherman believed that he could once again regain the power that he believed the general of the army should possess. He suggested William Belknap, a former brigadier general in the Army of the Tennessee and now a businessman, for the position of Secretary of War. When Belknap took the position, he began to increase his power, reducing Sherman's authority over the army. Sherman would protest, saying leaves of absence are granted, the stations of officers are changed, and other orders are now made directly to the army, not through the general, but direct through other officials and the adjutant general. So long as this is the case, I surely do not command the Army of the United States, and am not responsible for it. Frustrated, Sherman left Washington for a 2-month inspection of the West in 1871 to get away from the politicians. When he got back to Washington, he realized nothing had changed and decided to tour Europe. The tour would last a year. He thought to himself, Belknap controlled the army, so why was he even needed? Sherman used the excuse that he was going to observe and study the Franco-Prussian War that was raging, but in reality, it was to get away from Washington. He met the King and Queen of Spain, the Pope, traveled to Egypt, and visited Turkey, where he took the Sultan's royal yacht, to Russia, where he met with the Russian Tsar Alexander II. Austria-Hungary, Prussia, and England were also on his list, where he met with dignitaries and royalty alike. Everywhere he went, soldiers saluted him, and civilians gathered to look at the man who marched through Georgia. When Sherman returned to the United States in Washington, he found the same politics plaguing his position. He complained that he had no command, that the Secretary of War controlled the army and could issue orders to any unit or soldier he wanted without going through the general of the army. The tantrum he threw didn't change anything, but to get away from the politicians, he requested to be allowed to move his headquarters to St. Louis, citing Winfield Scott's removal of his headquarters to New York when he couldn't get along with the Secretary of War. The approval was given, even though his friends like Philip Sheridan and Edward Ord told him it was a mistake and that it would result in Belknap grabbing for more power. Sherman didn't care. He wanted to leave Washington. Sherman spent his time in St. Louis writing his memoirs and doing little in relation to the army, since Belknap superseded his powers. It wouldn't be until 1876 when Belknap was put on trial for getting kickbacks from merchants who sold to the military that the situation became better for Sherman. Belknap would be replaced by Alphonso Taft, and Taft would acquiesce to Sherman's demands, resulting in Sherman coming back to Washington. Amidst all this political infighting and trips to Europe, the Indian Wars progressed at a disjointed pace because of the fighting between departments about how to resolve issues. Sherman was part of the Sanborn Commission that made multiple treaties with various tribes, putting them on reservations, but when he met with them, he made sure they understood that not signing these treaties meant all-out war. The impeachment proceedings for President Johnson derailed the payments and supplies destined for the cooperative tribes who moved off their homeland and onto reservations. Sherman distributed the funds that were finally allocated, but found they were lacking. The Native Americans felt betrayed, and again, war broke out. As the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, Sherman took special interest in it, knowing how vital the railroad would be to national expansion and prosperity. The Army Department of the Platte was created to help protect the railroad workers. Sherman would walk among the soldiers and laborers for the railroad and hear them call out Uncle Billy. He would smile and keep walking. Many of the men working on the railroad had been with him on his marches around the South and still held affection for him. Sherman would state, "The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad is as great a victory as any in the war." Sherman had a fascination with the West. Every year he made a trip and sometimes 2 trips to inspect forts and army units. He would sit around the campfire with soldiers, telling them war stories and hearing others tell theirs. He rode the rails to see the progress being made by the Union Pacific and took delight in the improvement to the Army life that the railroad brought. In 1871, Sherman explored the Texas frontier to Oklahoma. He and the Inspector General Randolph B. Marcy left San Antonio, Texas, in wagons destined for Fort Sill in Oklahoma. They were escorted by 17 soldiers from the Black 10th Cavalry Regiment. They discovered burned ranches and indications of raids perpetrated by Native Americans. Miles behind Sherman and Marcy was a 10-wagon civilian supply train. Kiowa warriors, led by Satanta and others, attacked the supply train. When Sherman reached Fort Richardson, the few survivors told him about the attack. The group continued on to Fort Sill, arriving on May 23, 1871, he and Benjamin Grierson, the fort's commander, conferred with the local Indian agent. When the Kiowa leaders, including Satanta, arrived to receive their rations, the agent asked about the attack. Satanta admitted to the attack as a protest to the building of the railroad through their land. The agent sent Satanta to Sherman, where the Kiowa leader told Sherman proudly that he was the one who attacked the supply train. From the fort commander's porch, Sherman lectured Satanta about his cowardly act, and then had him arrested. When arrested, Satanta said that he had not led the attack, and had only watched. Sherman was unimpressed by the plea. Some of the Kiowas were thrown weapons by a person in their party. The black soldiers leveled their rifles, and a standoff began. In a small melee, one Indian was killed while another was wounded. Satanta and the others were taken off in chains, destined for Jacksboro, Texas. One of the leaders concealed a knife when being arrested, and used it to kill one of the guards taking him to Jacksboro. 2 other guards shot him and left his body beside the road. The trial found the Kiowa leaders guilty and sentenced to death. They were imprisoned instead, though, because of the political pressure placed on the governor of Texas. Eventually, they would be set free, which infuriated Sherman. Sherman would write to his son, "I know Indians well enough to believe that they must be made to feel the power of the United States before they cease their murders and robbery."